Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. This is Marina again, and we're going to be reading Mountains Beyond Mountains today. So last time we did chapter 7, which was about Dr. Paul Farmer meeting a girl called Ophelia in Haiti when he just got there and they sort of fell in love. Today we'll continue with chapter 8. It was soon after Ophelia left that Farmer first saw Cage, in late May 1983. Still searching for a place to do his work, we had traveled back to the Central Plateau and was spending some time in the company of an Haitian Anglican priest named Fritz Lafontaine. He was a small but imposing man, with a grand, almost leonine countenance and a forceful manner, sometimes abrupt. With assistance from the Episcopal Diocese of Upper South Carolina, Lafontaine administered a rather rudimentary one-doctor health clinic in Mirabelais. He and his wife had also helped to build schools and organize community councils and women's groups and programs for adult literacy in several small, impoverished towns in the region. Cage was one of those. Lafontaine had arranged and supervised the construction of a chapel and the beginning of a school in Cage. Farmer rode out there from Mirabelais in the back of the priest's pickup truck. Spring in Haiti is usually a fairly wet season, and much of the route was green, especially the stretch along Artibonite, where the river had cut a gorge too steep for agriculture. Farmer remembered admiring the trees and foliage there and the rushing river. Then the large dam and the reservoir heaved into view, and after that he found himself staring through clouds of grayish dust in his hair, dust up his nose, dust adhering to his sweaty skin, at an utterly changed landscape, with scarcely any trees, colored in shades of brown and white, a landscape he would remember as amazingly, biblically dry and barren. Cage, the squatter of settlement, lay in the midst of this arid desolation, half a mile up the road from huge freshwater reservoir. Most of the dwellings were crude wooden lean-tos with dirt floors, constructed, it seems, without much conviction. As a friend of his would later put it, Farmer noticed especially the roofs of these tiny hovels, roofs made of banana bark thatch, patched with rags, clearly leaky. Back in Mirabelais, the roofs of dusty, thin metal, of tin, had seemed to him like the emblems of poverty. But, he would say, the absence of tin in Cage screamed misery. Most of the adults he saw and talked to were clearly dejected. It was as if, he thought, the people who had built these miserable lean-tos weren't convinced that they'd ever live in anything better. Indeed, expected things to get worse. Many, perhaps the majority, were obviously ill, and there was no medicine for any sort being provided there. They seemed like the people he had seen in waiting rooms in the dreadful public clinics he had visited. It was as if the whole makeshift settlement were one of those waiting rooms. Haiti had already redefined poverty for him. Cage redefined it again. An individual might exist in misery this great almost anywhere, but it was hard to imagine an entire community poorer and sicker than this. Lafontaine's party spent the night in Cage on the floor of the school's classrooms, sleeping on old army blankets. Farmer remembered waking up at 2 a.m. to go to the bathroom and pissing loudly into a bucket, the sound he recalled from his days on the bus, preferably to stepping outside in the night among the parts of the creation that has always given him the creeps. Huge bugs, especially tarantulas. He didn't stop in Cage for long, not on that first visit. He kept traveling around Haiti, hitching rides from Bland sometimes riding in tap-taps among the peasants and the chickens and their baskets full of mango. He came down with dysentery, probably because his budget obliged him to eat food sold on the streets of the cities and towns. He remembered lying in a grubby hospital in Port-au-Prince, on a floor that lacked a toilet, and a middle-aged American woman, a public health expert whom he had gotten to know, visiting him there. She was saying that if he got any sicker, she's gonna take him back to the States. And he was telling her, no, he was all right, while thinking, please take me home. When he recovered, he went on sampling Haiti and anthropology and medicine in the context of Haiti. He attended voodoo ceremonies, talked to peasants about their lives, and found his way, among other things, to a hospital in Lionggang, a town about 12 miles west of Port-au-Prince, on Haiti's southern peninsula. He worked there for a while as a volunteer, assisting the nurses and doctors. So this person is very determined to learn as much about Haiti as possible. Even though he himself was getting sick, he still devoted himself to fully being immersed in this new culture. Farmer told me that he found his life's work not in books or in theories, but mainly through experience in Haiti. I would read stuff from scholarly texts and know they were wrong. Living in Haiti, I realized that a minor error in one setting of power and privilege could have an enormous impact on the poor in another. The eradication of the Creole pig, or the dam at Peligre, for example. He was already attracted to liberation theology, a powerful rebuke to the hiding away of poverty, he called it, a rebuke that transcends scholarly analysis. In Haiti, the essence of the doctrine came alive for him. Almost all the peasants he was meeting shared a belief that seemed like a distillation of liberation theology. Everybody else hates us, they tell him, but God loves the poor more, and our cause is just. The Marxist farmer had read, and many of the intellectuals he knew disdained religion, and it was true that some versions of Christianity and more than a few missionaries invited impoverished Haitians to what Pierre Lafontaine called the cult of resignation, into accepting their lot patiently, anticipating the afterlife. But the Christianity of the peasants farmers talked to had a different flavor. The shared conviction that the rest of the world was wrong for screwing them over, and that someone just and perhaps even omniscient was keeping score. He felt drawn back toward Catholicism now, not by his own belief, but in sympathy with theirs, as an act of what he'd called solidarity. He told me it was really the experience of seeing people up there in Cage, or in some awful hospital, or at a funeral, or knowing that people were awaking in their huts to 2 rooms full of hungry kids and still going on. Religion was the one thing they still had. How could a just God permit great misery? The Haitian peasants answered with a proverb. In literature translation, God gives but doesn't share. This meant, as Farmer would later explain, God gives us humans everything we need to flourish, but he's not the one who's supposed to divvy up the loot. That charge was laid upon us. Liberation theologians had a similar answer. You want to see where Christ crucified abides today? Go to where the poor are suffering and fighting back. That's where he is. Liberation theology, with its emphasis on the horrors of poverty and on redressing them in the here and now, its emphasis on service and remediation, seemed to fit the circumstances of Haiti, and it suited Farmer temperamentally because, for all his scholarship and interest in theories, his strongest impulses were pragmatic. He only seemed like a nerd. He would tell me years later, with undeniable accuracy, I'm an action kind of guy. Looking back at this first year in Haiti, Farmer would speak of the feeling that many things in his life coalesced into a vision of his life's proper work. But, he'd insist, this happened in stages, not all at once. For me, it was a process, not an event, a slow awakening as opposed to an epiphany. Then he remembered an incident from the time he spent in Leongain. Repossessing it, he said that perhaps there had been an epiphany after all. Working as a medical volunteer at the Hospital Saint Croix in Leongain, he got to know a young American doctor. He loved the Haitians, Farmer said. He was a very thoughtful guy. The man had worked in Haiti for about a year. Now, in a few days, he was going back to the United States. I realized, hearing him talk, that something had happened to me already, Farmer said. I wasn't feeling judgmental. Haiti was something he was seeing that he could leave and erase from his mind, and I was thinking, could I do that? He was leaving Haiti, really leaving in body and mind, and I realized I was going to have trouble with that. Isn't it going to be hard to leave? He asked the young doctor. Are you kidding? I can't wait. There's no electricity here. It's just brutal here. But aren't you worried about not being able to forget all this? There is so much disease here. No, the doctor said. I am an American, and I am going home. Right, me too, said Farmer. He thought about the conversation all the rest of the day and into the evening. What does that mean? I am an American. How do people classify themselves? He understood the doctor's position, but he really didn't know his own. The only thing he knew for sure was that he would become a doctor himself. Later that night, a young woman arrived at the hospital, pregnant and in throes of malaria. She had a very high parasitemia, Farmer remembered. Bad malaria. She went into a coma, and I didn't know the details then. I do now because it's my specialty. She needed a transfusion, and her sister was there. So there was no blood, and the doctor told her sister to go to Port-au-Prince to get her some blood. But he said that she would need money. So I had no money. I ran around the hospital, and I rounded up $15. I gave her the money, and she went away. But then she came back, and she didn't have enough for both a tap-tap and the blood. So meanwhile, the patient started having respiratory distress, and this pink stuff started coming out from her mouth. The nurses were saying, it's hopeless, and other people were saying, we should do a C-section. I said, there's got to be some way to get her more blood. Her sister was beside herself. She was sobbing and crying. The woman had 5 kids. The sister said, this is terrible. You can't even get a blood transfusion if you are poor. And she said, we are all human beings. The words seemed like the answer to the question he had asked himself earlier that day. Was being an American a sufficient identity unto itself? She said that again and again. He remembered, we are all human beings. This is a great question to think about. A lot of the times we classify ourselves as where we come from and our backgrounds, how we grew up. But she is true. We are all human beings, and if we could all care about each other, the world wouldn't be such a bad place to live in. The woman and her unborn baby died. Oh, that's sad. Afterward, the sister lavished thanks on Farmer, and of course this made him feel acutely his failure at emergency fundraising. He was obviously upset, and the doctors and nurses seemed to focus their attention on him. The nurses were saying, "Poor Paul, what a sweet young man." And he knew what the doctors were saying. He is new here. He is green. He is naive. Remembering this year later, he was still framing this his retort. "Yeah, but I got staying power. That's the thing. I wasn't naive, in fact." Or perhaps he was, a little. He decided to raise money to buy the hospital its own blood banking equipment. He wrote to his relatives and the parents of his friends from Duke. He was seeing dreadful things in Haiti, he wrote. He described the project. Many checks arrived. In the end, he collected a few $1,000s. Wow. He was elated. He wrote to Ophelia. "I'm off to Leongain for a meeting with the director of Hospital of St. Croix to discover big plans." But not long afterward, Ophelia received another letter. "My stint down here at the hospital isn't turning out exactly as I thought it would. It is not that I'm unhappy working here. The biggest problem is that the hospital is not for the poor. I am taken aback. I really am. Everything has to be paid for in advance. The central imperative of liberation theology to provide a preferential option for the poor seemed like a worthy life's goal to him. Of course, one could pursue it almost anywhere, but clearly the doctrine implied making choices among degrees of poverty. It would make sense to provide medicine in the places that needed it most, and there was no place needier than Haiti, at least in the Western Hemisphere, and he hasn't seen any place in Haiti needier than Cage. He didn't stick around in Leongain to see the blood bank get installed. He'd found out that the hospital would charge patients for its use. He told me he had these thoughts as he headed back toward Central Plateau. "I'm going to build my own hospital, and there will be none of that there. Thank you." This is very interesting to read, but not surprising because healthcare is expensive and it's very unlikely that you can get it for free. Sometimes when I go to the emergency room, it seemed like they cared more about whether I can pay for the service instead of whether I can get better. When he returned to Lingang to the Central Plateau, Farmer went to work for a while at Pierre Lafontaine's clinic in Miravallis. It resembled a lot of the clinics he had seen in his months exploring Haiti. Patients were waited in a line for a visit with the lung doctor, who didn't bother to get their medical histories or give them real physical exams. A perfunctory exchange with a doctor who'd rather have been anywhere else but here, Farmer would remembered. Then the patients took their filthy corncob stoppered bottles to the pharmacy and paid to have them filled up with cough medicine and vitamins. A sorry spectacle, which included at times the staff yelling at the patients for bringing really, really filthy bottles. With Pierre Lafontaine's blessing, Farmer began to focus on the wretched, dusty squatter settlements up the road in Cage. It was a big moment in his life. Going up to Cage, which was back then a truly awful place compared to Miravallis, was for me, bizarrely, a relief. No clinic at all was a relief, not because there wasn't an urgent need for a clinic in Cage. I just knew I couldn't work in a clinic like that one in Miravallis, which was, I had learned, altogether representative of other clinics for poor Haitians. And I also knew, I hope, that it wasn't about how I felt or how the hapless Haitian doctor felt. It was about the patients and their awful outcomes. Cage needed a clinic, a hospital, a community health system. In Farmer's conception, the facilities should provide service to the destitute for free, and those services should meet the real needs of the place and of individual patients. So the first step was to find out exactly what the needs were. Farmer began modestly with a preliminary health census. He enlisted 5 Haitians, all about his age, all of whom had gone at least as far in school as the first year of junior high, and they went from hut to hut through Cage and 2 neighboring villages, tallying up the numbers of families, recent births and deaths, and the apparent causes for morbidity and mortality. That first survey was rather informal, but it confirmed what Farmer had already suspected. Mortality among infants and juveniles were horrific. He learned, too, about the central importance of maternal mortality, how the deaths of mothers, common events in those squatter settlements, led to scales of catastrophes in families, to hunger and prostitution, to disease and other deaths. This first survey was just a small beginning, a piece of an apprenticeship in public health and medicine, and also anthropology. In Kent in early 1984, Farmer had another memorable encounter with malaria, in its way as instructive as the one back in Lingayen. The patient was a young woman. Her father decided to have her treated by a local voodoo priest, but after a lot of discussion, the mother agreed to let Farmer and an Haitian doctor treat her with chloroquine as well. She recovered. In an essay which he titled An Anthropologist Within, Farmer wrote, in the aftermath of the case, he had wondered obsessively about the role anthropology should assume in his life. He had been taught that an ethnographer should observe, not try to change what was being observed. But practiced in that way, anthropology seemed impotent in the face of everyday problems of adequate nutrition, clean water, and illness prevention. It is clear by the end of the essay that anthropology now interests him less as a discipline unto itself than as a tool for what he called intervention. He had settled not for a synthesis between observing and acting, but for doctoring and public health work that would be partly guided by anthropology. Its uses were obvious. A doctor knew nothing about local beliefs might end up at war with voodoo priests, but a doctor anthropologist who understood those beliefs could find ways to make voodoo hooligans his allies. A doctor who didn't understand local culture would probably make mistakes many patients complaints for a bizarre superstition, or at best be utterly baffled by the female complaints called vous sans legate, for example. The condition was said to be brought by seizismen, that is, by a surprise or by someone's frightening action. Move son, bad blood, could follow, and produce in turn leadgate, a condition in which a nursing mother's milk was spoiled or stopped flowing. None of this would be mysterious to a young ethnographer doctor who, like Farmer, was willing to puzzle out the social meanings of the syndrome. Farmer would write, "The most striking thing about Move-son disorder is the lurid extremity of its symbolism. Two of the body's most vital constituents, blood and milk, are turned into poisons. The powerful metaphors serve, it may be inferred, as a warning against the abuse of women, especially pregnant or nursing ones." In the course of his research on Move-son Leadgate, he consulted a local Haitian woman, asking her about the herbal remedies for the condition. She gave him the information and then told him, "Surely you're collecting these leaves in order to better understand their power and improve their efficacy." This was a lesson reiterated. The people of Cange weren't interested in having their suffering merely scrutinized. He should be interested in both research and action. Farmer was probably fortunate, certainly he thought so, to have done some work in anthropology and medicine and public health in Haiti before he studied those disciplines at Harvard. He had a gift for academic pursuits, but Haiti ensured that his taste for them would be limited. Farmer entered Harvard Medical School in the fall of 1984. He was only 24. Then again, he told me once, I was fully formed at 23. He meant, I think, that by then he had his philosophy and worldview in order, and knew that he wanted to marry them to action. First of all, in Cambridge. He didn't linger in Cambridge. He stayed around Harvard just long enough to get oriented and to gather up textbooks, which he took him back to the Central Plateau. At the medical school, the first 2 years of the curriculum consisted mainly of large lecture courses. Often, Farmer would show up in Cambridge just in time for lab practicums or exams. Then he'd go back to Haiti. It wasn't as though no one noticed. By the second year, his classmates nicknamed him Paul Foreigner. But while this kind of commuting by a student was almost certainly unprecedented, it would have been hard for any professor to disapprove. The young man was trying to bring medicine to people without doctors. Besides, his grades were excellent, some of the best in his class. Wow, this is very impressive. Now we're moving on to chapter 9. The combination of Harvard and Haiti had begun to form a kind of belief in Farmer. He would tell me years later. The fact that any sort of religious faith was so disdained at Harvard and so important to the poor, not just in Haiti but elsewhere, made me ever more convinced that faith must be something good. And if the landless peasants of Cange needed to believe that someone omniscient was keeping score, by now Farmer felt the need to believe something like that himself. In the peasant phrase, an unnecessary death was a stupid death, and he was seeing a lot of those. Surely someone is witnessing this horror show, he'd say to himself. I know it sounds shallow, the opiate thing, needing to believe, palliating pain, but it didn't feel shallow. It was more profound than any sentiments I'd known, and I was taken by the idea that in an ostensibly godless world that worshipped money and power, or more seductively, a sense of personal efficacy and advancement, like Duke and Harvard, there was still a place to look for God, and that was in the suffering of the poor. You want to talk crucifixion? I'll show you crucifixion. When Ophelia went back to the Central Plateau to work with Paul in the summer of 1985, she saw that when he dressed up now in Haiti, he often wore a large wooden cross hanging outside his shirt. But the apparatus only reinforced a quality of priestliness that she had sensed in him before, and that quality was far from thorough. He would say some years later that he had faith, and then add, I also had faith in penicillin, rifampin, isoniazid, and the good absorption of fluoroquinolone in bench science, clinical trials, scientific progress, that HIV is the cause of every case of AIDS, that the rich oppress the poor, that wealth is flowing in the wrong direction, that this will cause more epidemics and kill millions. I have faith that those things are true too. So if I had to choose between lib-theo, or any ology. I would go with science, as long as service to the poor went along with it. But I don't have to make that choice, do I? He had never cared much about the religious dogma he had been taught as a child, and he didn't believe in most of it now. He would say, for instance, I am still looking for something in the sacred text that says, Thou shalt not use condoms. He was still the very young man who would challenge Ophelia to mango-eating contests that turned into slimy food fights, and he was quite willing to ignore the injunctions about chastity that the bishop had uttered at his confirmation in Florida years ago. Indeed, he was happy to skip church services in order to violate those injunctions. Ophelia remembered the afternoon when she gave himself to him. She chuckled at the term. It was a Sunday. They were in Mirabilis and got caught in a rainstorm and ran back to Pierre Lafontaine's rectory. The building was empty because everyone else was in church, and in Haiti, church services tend to last a long time. Moreover, most Haitians don't like being out in the rain. You knew that until it ended. No one would be coming, she said, so we took a shower together. She remembered the sound of the rain on the roof, the smell of the smoke from the fire out in the courtyard, lit for Sunday dinner. The moment, she said, still stood in her memory as the most romantic of her life. She spent the whole summer in Haiti with Paul. In the evenings, over coffee, she'd help him with his formal medical education. She'd try to help, that is. He had distilled the contents of his medical texts into index cards. He had great piles of them, thousands of flashcards. On one side he had written, in an elegant left-handed script, a question, such as, What's God got to do with lysosome? And he'd have added the symbol for musical notes around the words, indicating that the question should be sung. The music side of the card might read, for example, Show me, sir, the lesion in Horner's syndrome and oculomotor nerve paralysis, and what the devil's an Argyll Robertson pupil. The answers on the back often included drawings, many of them lovely, Ophelia thought. In that case, a drawing of a neural pathway of the eye. Ophelia looked through the stack of index cards for a question that Paul might get wrong, hoping he would. It felt good to be able to read him the correct answer, as if she was actually helping. Okay, PJ, what's dystrophic calcification? When abnormal deposition of calcium salts take place in necrotic tissues, it is known as dystrophic calcification. He'd lift a finger in the air. Of course, it is not caused by hypercalcemia, he'd smile. Metastatic calcification is associated with hypercalcemia, however. She'd stare at the back of the index, trying not to look let down. Right, very good, PJ. This seems like Paul Farmer is a very smart student, and he has a lot of fun in studying. He draws pictures on his flashcards, and unlike most of us who really have to struggle in pain, he seems to be enjoying all this process. They walked in the villages from time to time. On the way, he'd point out plants. Indigo, he'd say, and then with an eager smile, What's the Latin name? He had been doing this since she had first met him. At moments, she wondered if he was trying to make her feel uneducated. No, you twist, of course not, she thought. He just liked to say the names. It's one side of his ideas of fun. But it was hard to avoid comparing herself with him. At almost every hut they visited, food would appear, a great deal of it unsavory to both of them. Items from what Paul called the fifth food group, and making faces at each other when their hosts weren't looking. They pretended to munch happily on things like meat-filled pastries that smelled like sweat. Then one time their hosts presented each of them with what looked like a fried egg afloat in pig fat and gristle. She took a bite and almost gagged on it. When the host turned away for a moment, she handed her plate to Paul, whispering, "Here, you eat it." He took the plate and slurped the contents down. Then he looked at her and smiled. "B minus," he said. On the way back, they laughed about the incident, and yet all the time she had eaten things that she could hardly bear to look at. This one occasion when she failed the test stood out for her. Coming down a steep trail in one of the hills around Cange, she lost her footing momentarily. There was Haitians nearby. "Watch your step," someone called to her in Creole. She felt the muscles in her jaw flex. Did they think she was a weakling? An elderly man came up to her and offered her his walking stick. "No, I am fine," she said. Paul's face looked stern. "Don't refuse something like that," he said to her emphatically. "It's an incredible gift." Of course he was right. Her cheeks burned. They slept in different quarters in Cange. The patriarch of the place was, after all, a priest. One night, about to turn in, she decided that morning she'd get up earlier than Paul. She set her alarm clock for 5. She woke to the sound of his voice singing up to her from the courtyard below her window, and she was laying in bed thinking, "I just want to do something better than him for one moment." Paul had extended the refined health census he had begun around Cange in 1983. He had found a book that describes a census done in part of rural India, and he used it as a manual. Ophelia worked on gathering data. This meant walking from village to village, sometimes with Paul, more often with local youths he had recruited, who knew the ways, down gullies and up mountainsides, along paths half covered in underbush. The heat felt enormous. Her face would turn bright red, but her Creole greatly improved, and every trip seemed important and wrenching. She'd go to a tiny red 2-room hut. A chair would appear, and the peasants would offer her a drink and talk about their pain and misery while she took notes. She would ask them where they were born, and they would tell her what president had been in power at the time, or date their births to before or after the dam. Ophelia would ask, "How many live here?" And the mother or father of the house would reel off names, sometimes as many as 11, and Ophelia would look up and see silvers of sky through the banana bark roof and think about the rainy season. She'd see the metal cups on the stilts of their small granaries and think, "Rats." She noted a distinctive smell in the crowded huts, not smelly socks stinky, but the close smell of people in poverty, many hungry people breathing. Sometimes she went to houses where people were dying, and often, especially in Cange, among the water refugees. These were children in the throes of one or another of the diarrheal diseases. To get water, the people of Cange had to climb down a steep 800-foot hillside. They dip their calabash gourds or recycled plastic jugs in the stagnant reservoir, then carry them back up the hill. And of course, they'd want to make the water last, so it would sit in the jug or gourd uncovered for days. The solution came from a team of Haitians and American engineers. The Americans were members of a church group from the Episcopal Diocese of Upper South Carolina, who had been helping out Pierre Lafontaine for years. A sparkling underground river burst out near the base of the 800-foot hill. Before the dam, it had been a main source of local drinking water. The engineers devised a plan to use the force that river to carry its own water in a pipe up to communal water spigots that would be constructed in Cambridge. Almost as soon as this was accomplished, Ophelia remembered, infant deaths began dropping. Farmer was learning about the great importance of water to public health, and he was conceiving a great fondness for technology in general, also scorn for the ludite trap. He liked to illustrate the meaning of that phrase with the story of the time when he came back to Cambridge from Harvard and found that Lafontaine had overseen the construction of 30 fine-looking concrete laterns scattered through the village. But, Farmer asked, are they appropriate technology? He'd pick up the term in a class at the Harvard School of Public Health. As a rule, it meant that one should only use the simplest technologies required to do a job. Do you know what appropriate technology means? It means good things for rich people and bad things for the poor, the priest growled, and refused to speak to Farmer again for a couple of days. Lafontaine was also supervising the construction of a clinic in Cambridge. The South Carolinians had put up the money. The facility would have a laboratory, of course. Farmer get hold of a pamphlet about how to equip lab in third world places published by the World Health Organization. It made modest recommendations. You could make do with only one sink. If it wasn't easy to arrange for electricity, you could rely on solar power. A homemade solar-powered microscope would serve for most purposes. He threw the booklet away. The first microscope in Cambridge was a real one, which he stole from Harvard Medical School. Redistributive justice, he'd later say. We're just helping them not to go to hell. The enterprise in Cambridge and the surrounding villages was essentially the creation, from scratch, of a public health system, with Pierre Lafontaine as the construction boss. Amazing how quickly and durable he got things built in a place without electricity, stores, or a serviceable road. Increasingly, the vision for this health system came from Farmer. A lot of the plan was straightforward, steps that any school of public health would recommend. He'd begun with the census because that was the way to identify problems and begin building records and to create a baseline against which future censuses would measure how well the new system was working. He planned for the creation of what he called a first line of defenses out in the communities. These would include vaccination programs, protected water supplies, and sanitation, and at the heart of the defenses, a cadre of people from the villages trained to administer medicine and give classes on health or to treat minor ailments and recognize the symptoms of grave ones like TB, malaria, typhoid. He imagined his project for women, gynecological services, health education, and family planning to reduce local maternal mortality. What the first line of defenses failed to prevent would be handled at the second line, at the new clinic Bon Sauveur in Cambridge, which Farmer imagined would someday have a hospital beside it. To many people in public health, such an array of projects would seem ambitious enough, seemed too much to hope for in a place as impoverished as Cambridge. But in 1985, Farmer had grown impatient with standard definitions of public health. The great burdens of disease in Cambridge were just a symptom of general deprivation. He'd say to Ophelia, he'd say to her, we have to think about health in the broadest possible sense. This notion came in part from Lafontaine. He had built the first school in Cambridge back in late 1970s. It had a thatched roof. Classes that didn't fit inside were held under a mango tree. In early 1980s, with money from South Carolina, Lafontaine had erected a much larger building, 2 stories tall, on a small plateau on the hillside above Highway 3. To Farmer, the building looked faintly grandiose, looming above the shacks of Crange. He would write, "The establishment of a school may seem a bit out of place given the homelessness, landlessness, and hunger of many of the water refugees, but it appeared that they themselves did not feel that way. Children flocked to the new facility." One peasant woman explained, "A lot of us wondered what would have happened if we had known how to write. If we had known how to write, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation now." And a school could serve as a place for teaching lessons about health and for providing free meals to malnourished children without injuring their dignity. To build a school was to unite the practical and the moral. Farmer would say, "Clean water and health care, and school, and food and tin roofs and cement floors, all of these things should constitute a set of basics that people must have as a birthright." All this would require money beyond what the South Carolinians could provide. Farmer had only limited experience as a fundraiser. In 1985, though, he got lucky. 2 years before, in late 1983, he had gone to Boston for his standard pre-admissions interview at Harvard, and he had visited a charity named Project Bread. He asked the organization for a few $1,000s to build a bread oven in Cambridge. He'd often hear Pierre Lafontaine say that Cambridge needed a bakery. It had been an easy sell. Farmer was told that the charity had a donor who had asked that his money go to feed poor people in Haiti. "Who is he?" Farmer asked. "He is an anonymous donor." The bread oven was built, not far from the school, in the summer of 1984. Early the following year, a Harvard Medical School publication printed Farmer's essay, "The Anthropologist Within." Soon afterward, the director of Project Bread contacted Farmer. The bread oven's anonymous donor had read the article. "I'd like to meet this kid," the donor had supposedly said. "He sounds like a winner." "If he wanted to meet me, tell him to come to Haiti," Farmer replied. He had been told that the donor's name was Tom White, and that the man owned a heavy construction firm in Boston. Farmer imagined portly Republicans smoking stoogies and cutting back alley deals with the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, keeping the unions out. Farmer went to pick up White at the Francos Duvalier Airport. The person he found waiting there in the hot wind was a pink-faced man in his 60s, dressed in polyester golfing clothes, including the plaid pants. White has brought along a roll of cash, which he had soon distributed among beggars, not an obnoxious act in Farmer's philosophy, but hardly a sufficient one. Farmer narrated Haiti in the truck on the way to Cambridge, and White seemed appropriately horrified, but Farmer was still wary of him and didn't try to hide the fact. He was only 25, and not, he would admit, fully formed when it came to dealing with potential donors. Inside the Johnson truck, the conversation turned to American politics. White remarked, "Well, I didn't vote for Reagan." "What do you mean?" asked Farmer. "I didn't vote for Reagan." "So you voted against your own interests?" asked Farmer. "Is that a sin?" said White. Remembering that moment, White told me, "So he went from being cool to very warm." White went on, "He was fresh as hell to me. But I liked him, because if you said boo and he didn't think boo was right, he'd tell you. He was way ahead of me on service to the poor. The next time Farmer returned to Cambridge, Tom White took him to lunch, and they had an argument about guilt. White said he thought it was a useless emotion. On the contrary, Farmer said, it could be quite helpful. White had gotten divorced from his first wife. He had made a very generous voluntary settlement with her, and footed all the bills for his children's keep and education. His second marriage, to a woman with 6 children of her own, was hardly the conventional rich man's. Nevertheless, he said, he felt very guilty about the fact of his divorce. It wasn't what Farmer had in mind. What he endorsed, he said, was the guilt some rich people felt toward the poor, because it would cost them to part with some of their money, and they ought to feel guilty besides. Actually, White had been giving away money for years to Catholic charities and needy friends even before he had much of his own. He grew up in an Irish Catholic household, devastated by his father's drinking. He had a colorful-sounding life. College at Harvard, where he majored in Romance languages, and then the Army, where he became, reluctantly at first, the aide to General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division. White parachuted into Normandy the night before D-Day and later into Holland. Though he would say he didn't regret participating, he came away with a hatred for war. And though he liked Taylor personally and admired the general's courage, he learned to dislike the tendency of the powerful to view human beings as pins out on a map. Also to dislike the prerequisites of power, through seeing a young paratrooper crushed by his own pack, overweight with unnecessary items he carried for the general. After the war, White has built his father's construction company into what was now the largest in Boston. He had been the intimate of cardinals, had served on the boards of 9 institutes, and had sat with the presidential party at JFK's inauguration. But he felt uncomfortable among most of the rich and famous, and generally shunned the press. He told me, cryptically, that he had been depressed at various times of his life. Also, he had a low self-image, adding, "But in my business, all you had to be was low bidder." When I asked him what had caused him to place large bets on Farmer, on a medical student in his 20s, White said, "He appealed to me immediately. So intelligent, so dedicated to his work." He thought for a time. "I really can't explain it. I was probably looking for someone to hang my hat with." Certainly Haiti upset White. He found the road to Cambridge especially offensive. "Jogging along that damn road," he'd say. He never traveled it without thinking, this would be so easy to fix. He remembered his first view of Kwashiorkor. There was a kid with red hair and a bloated belly, and I said right away, "Put in a feeding program here." White found it easy to imagine himself at Haitian, a child with big eyes and a memorable smile, encountered in a dirt-floored hut, made him feel like bringing over the company bulldozers. "For Christ's sake," he'd say to Farmer or Pure Lafontaine, "put a tin roof and pour a concrete floor. I'll give you the money." When Farmer was back in Boston, doing his internship at the Brigham, White would drive over at lunchtime and buy sandwiches at the restaurant inside the hospital. He and Farmer would eat them in White's car. One day, White asked Farmer, who looked pale as usual, "You eating enough?" "Oh, I'm fine," said Farmer. "Need any money?" "No," said Farmer. "Well, maybe $40. White happened to have a wad of $100 bills in his pocket. He tossed one into Farmer's lap. "You look hungry to me." Saying this, he felt impelled to reach his pocket again. He tossed another 100 to Farmer. "Please, for God's sake, eat," he said, and to emphasize that point, he gave Farmer yet another 100. Farmer looked down at the loot. "Now I can tell you what happened last night." He had gone to the home of an AIDS patient whom he had treated at the Brigham, and found out that the man was about to be evicted. I signed my check over to him. "Geez, Paul, don't you think that's kind of impractical?" Farmer smiled. "Well," he said, "God sent you today." White often found himself running errands in Boston for projects in Cambridge, picking up things like sinks and loading them into the truck of his Mercedes. One load of sinks was for a new clinic. The first clinic turned out to have been badly designed. White paid to have it rebuilt. He did this quietly, not asking for credit. "Not even a plaque with his name on it," said Farmer. One time when they were together in Boston, White said, "You know, Paul, sometimes I'd like to chuck it all and work like a missionary with you in Haiti." Farmer thought for a while, then said, "In your practical case, that would be a sin." And this is the end of chapter 9. So we learned that Paul Farmer was so dedicated in changing the situation in Haiti, and he met this really wealthy donor who keeps giving him money, and they're doing very good work together. So thanks for being with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.